Euranet Plus Panorama is a weekly review of European news broadcast by our network of EU radio stations.
Hi there, I'm Jo and you're listening to Euranet Plus Panorama. There's a general sense of dissatisfaction among younger members of Europe's electorate with both the political system and its representatives. This comes down in part to a sense of remoteness from everything that happens in the corridors of Brussels and Strasbourg, and a certain lack of transparency. Young people feel they have little influence and are frustrated with the slow pace of change. Meanwhile, their priorities may also differ from those of older generations. With a view to better engaging young people with the EU and giving them a voice, the European institutions labelled 2022 the Year of Youth. Simultaneously, it decided to shake things up a bit, throwing itself into the Conference on the Future of Europe. This year-long initiative, running from April 2021 to May 2022, was designed to gather the input and pique the interest of Europe's youth. But did it work? Loïc Perrin, a 23-year-old Belgian who took part in the conference debates, tells RTBF that it proved of limited value.
So there were plenty of proposals that emerged, and we sent them to Europe so that they could process these proposals within the framework of their plenary assembly. And we were clearly left a little unsatisfied in the end with this process. We arrived with a lot of ambition, with a desire to bring about change, and then, in the end, it's all non-binding. And we must also remember that it was a one-off. So that was another limitation of the Conference on the Future of Europe. It was both non-binding and, what's more, it was a one-off event.
On the flip side, says Savas Papadopoulos in an interview with Sky, the initiative sowed the seeds of change. Papadopoulos is coordinator of the EU Youth Hub at ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy.
Look, the Conference on the Future of Europe was a very interesting initiative on the part of the European Union. The goal was essentially to bring citizens closer together. The so-called democratic deficit was that Brussels is too far away. The European Union has tried to respond to this by bringing citizens' views and thoughts into the spotlight. Now, if you ask me if it had an impact, I can tell you yes, it did. But it depends on one's perspective, I guess. It can clearly be described as a great experiment. I can't claim we had a strong presence, but we had citizen participation. Yes, perhaps it was not to the extent we would have liked, but surely the seeds it planted can help us look ahead to something better.
As part of its follow-up to the Year of Youth, the Commission has rolled out a series of measures to, and I quote, give young people a stronger voice in EU policymaking. One way of doing this is through the EU Youth Check, or Youth Test, a tool designed to assess the impact of all new policies and legislation on young people before they become a fait accompli. Rarej Voicu is president-elect of the European Youth Forum, an organisation set up to serve as the voice of young Europeans. During a recent interview in the Euranet Plus studio in Brussels, Voicu told our Latvia's radio colleague that they have put forward a 5-step methodology to ensure the youth check is both inclusive and meaningful, and that the bloc's policies and legislation are, in turn, as relevant and sustainable as possible. And we're talking about all the bloc's policies and legislation here, not just those considered to be of youth interest, as Voicu explains.
Young experts and organizations of young experts exist in all sectors, whether it comes to healthcare experts or young economists and so on. So we are not limiting the youth test to a certain policy area, but we believe that all policies made today, regardless of the political area or the policy area in which they're made, be it, again, financial topics or the financial policy of the European Union or defense policy as well when it comes to youth peace and security and all of those matters, young people have relevant things to say. So it's important to listen to their voices in a structured manner.
One very visible way in which young people can be given a more active role in political decision-making is through voting. And many organisations, including the European Youth Forum, strongly advocate for a blanket reduction of the voting age to 16 across the bloc. In most EU countries, the minimum voting age is set at 18. But in Greece, 17-year-olds have the right to have their voices heard. And in Austria, Belgium, Germany and Malta, 16-year-olds can express their views on the future of Europe. Robin Lebrun from Sevipol, a political research institute linked to Brussels' ULB University, unequivocally supports giving younger people the vote, as he tells a journalist from RTBF.
One's first experience of voting is itself an experience of political socialization. It's when you learn how to use your political rights, which is why it's important to start as early as possible. In fact, it probably does matter when you first take part.
In the same interview, Laura Oetendal at the Institute of Political Science at Belgium's UCL University highlights another potential benefit of giving 16-year-olds political responsibility.
Another interesting result is that when we give young people a voice, when we give them access to the ballot box, they also revive the interest of others, for example their parents, by bringing political discussion to the dinner table.
And what about encouraging more aspiring young politicians to stand for election? Would this help young voters to feel better represented? The European Youth Forum thinks so, as Vice President Elias Drey explains to EU Radio.
Nous, au Forum européen de la jeunesse, avec les partis politiques,
we at the European Youth Forum have been working with youth wings of the pro-European political parties to ensure they prioritise putting young people on their lists at a national level, not just non-eligible places far down the list, but in a position to become real MEPs. And that's not to say only young people are needed. No, not at all. But we need young people as well. A list with the top 5 or 6 people, all between the ages of 40 and 75, doesn't inspire dreams. It doesn't inspire a desire for the future.
45 et 75 ans, ça fait pas rêver. Ça donne pas envie d'avenir.
But Robin Lebrun cautions against putting all young people in the same basket.
You might think they're different from older people, but they're not a homogeneous category. To see young people as a single group is a mistake. We're not dealing with a group that has one sole way of seeing things, that votes in a particular way. No.
Sociologist Piotr Mikiewicz from the University of Lower Silesia concurs, as Polski Radio reports.
What we are dealing with here is the creation of a non-existent entity. Who are young people? There are various definitions, but the broadest one is people between the ages of 15 and 35. This is a sea of people who are at different stages in their careers, at different stages in their lives, facing different problems. Can you imagine anyone who will want to address all these issues and only these issues in their political manifesto? Political representation is traditionally not tied to age categories, young, adult, old, but to categories of social class.
On the other hand, 24-year-old French university graduate Maud tells EU Radio that it isn't so misguided to speak of generational differences.
I don't think that we all have the same vision of Europe, but our generation does have more or less the same concerns, at any rate. So that brings us closer together.
Either way, maybe introducing youth quotas is not actually the answer. Jascha Levstik, the former president of the European Youth Parliament Slovenia, thinks we need to have a little more faith in the wisdom that comes with age, says RTV Slovenia.
I don't think the solution is to have the same percentage of young people in decision-making positions as in society. Ultimately, it seems to me that we have to rely on the fact that older generations are simply more experienced. And I'm not talking specifically in terms of politics now. They're also more educated. From this point of view, I think the best way to engage young people and make the most of generational differences is to introduce them to politics by listening to what they're interested in and what they will be interested in going forward. In this way, young people will be prepared for the generational shift that always takes place in a normal society.
Political scientist and chair of Bulgaria's National Youth Forum, Atanas Radev, points out to BNR that instilling civic values from an early age is vital so as to prepare the young for taking the reins.
We cannot expect that a young person reaching the age of 18 and leaving the education system will have all the necessary knowledge, skills and competence to adequately communicate with institutions and be an active citizen. This is where civil society organisations, NGOs, come in, because they can support the development of precisely this knowledge, these skills and competencies.
Politics and activism are, of course, two sides of the same coin. And it could be argued that younger people make better activists, holding older, more traditional politicians to account. The passion, energy and fresh ideologies of youth are vital in driving progress. But change ultimately needs to come about through the established political structures, which is where those with more experience come in. But maybe there's a way to bring the two things together, suggests Eva Brás Pinho, who is, at 24, the youngest MP in Portugal's Social Democratic Party. Radio Renascença shares her comments.
I
think the parties are partly responsible. We must try to be as open as possible to young people who want to contribute only in specific areas. Activism grows, but sometimes young people don't want to take part in the party agenda because there's one specific area they feel drawn to. For example, they want to work on climate change. But maybe they don't want to discuss politics in a broader way, or at least don't want to contribute in that broader way.
And to close, Estonian climate activist and influencer Kertu Birgit Anton urges all young people who have a vote to use it. Because, she says, each vote is worth more in the EU elections than in a national election with a higher turnout. Kuku Radio shares her appeal.
What I would like to say to young people is that because the turnout for the European elections is so low, your vote in these elections carries more weight than, for example, in national parliamentary elections. This is where a relatively small number of young people and a small number of votes can influence which names get into the European Parliament and make decisions for Estonia and the European Union.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back again next week for another look around the Euranet Plus network. Make sure you come back then.